Paul, let's stay on the issue of records. You've got a new ad up in South Carolina taking direct aim at Senator Santorum. You call him a corporate lobbyist, a Washington insider with a record of betrayal. You also call him corrupt in that ad. Senator Santorum is standing right here. Are you willing to stand by those charges and explain them?
Well, it was a quote. Somebody did make a survey, and I think he came out as one of the top corrupt individuals because he took so much money from the lobbyists. But really what the whole... There it goes again.
They caught you not telling the truth, Ron.
But what really counts is his record. I mean, he's a big government, big spending individual because, you know, he preached the fact that he wanted a balanced budget amendment but voted to raise the debt to 5 times. So he is a big government person. And we as Republicans know something about right to work. He voted against right to work. He voted along with No Child Left Behind.